On July 3, 1988, in the Persian Gulf, not far from where these images were taken, a U.S. Navy warship shot down Iran Air Flight 655, an airliner, killing 290 civilians. The warship involved in this tragic incident was this one, the USS Vincennes, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser launched in 1985 and which was decommissioned in 2005. Though her career lasted 20 years, which honestly isn't that long for a ship, the history of this vessel will always be defined by one single instant of that history. The instant those missiles fired from her struck that Airbus A300 at 10:24 in the morning on a Sunday. This video is about the USS Vincennes, her story from beginning to end. Because of the centrality of the Flight 655 disaster to that story, there's no way we can avoid it. It'd be like telling the story of the Titanic without mentioning the iceberg. But there is more to this ship's story than that one terrible Sunday morning in July. She's a ship completely overshadowed by that event, but her history is worth considering as a whole, on its own terms, and that's what I hope to do here. Some ships are fated to be associated with a single event to the exclusion of almost everything else. The Mary Celeste is the ghost ship whose crew vanished. The Lusitania was sunk by a German sub in an appalling act of war. The Arizona was blown up by a Japanese bomb at Pearl Harbor. Similarly, the Vincennes is the ship that shot down that Iranian airliner for a number of complex reasons. But to do the ship justice, we have to consider where it came from, what happened before, and what happened in its life after that day. Hi, Sean here, and I'm back doing another ship history after some of my recent deep dive projects in other historical subjects. It's very rare for me to start a ship video with a personal anecdote, but as it's why I chose to do this subject in the first place, it's arguably relevant. I vividly remember July 3rd, 1988. I was 16 and spending the summer with my sister who lived in Omaha, Nebraska. For that long 4th of July weekend, she was invited by some friends, newlyweds, to spend a couple of days at a house on a lake some distance from town. I believe it was probably the Fremont State Recreation Area. On Sunday afternoon, as barbecues were firing up and speedboats were roaring around the lake, the news came over the TV that the U.S. had shot down an Iranian airliner in the Persian Gulf, mistakenly believing it to have been a fighter plane on an attack course. I remember being scared because it seemed like there might be a war with Iran, and I was 2 years away from draft age. Of course, nothing like that happened, but I do remember the TV being on in the resort house on the island in that lake, as the 4th of July celebrations were gearing up. I have a good memory for the names of ships, so I remembered Vincennes. The story of this ship, though, begins long before 1988. To understand where she came from and how she ended up in the Persian Gulf on that Sunday, we have to go back to the depths of the Cold War. The 1950s and early 60s were a period of transition for the U.S. Navy. Old steam-powered ships were giving way to nuclear propulsion, and for surface vessels, guns were being largely phased out in favor of guided missiles, which were faster and more accurate. And a new development that would change everything was picking up speed: computers. In 1964, the U.S. Navy, working with defense contractors, began developing a comprehensive system driven by computers that would essentially automate the process of identifying a warship's potential targets and launching missiles to shoot them down. This is a vastly complex story with a lot of technical jargon and acronyms, which I'm going to try to avoid, but suffice it to say, by the end of the 60s, a prototype of this system was starting to emerge, the Aegis system, which integrated radar, computers, and missiles into a cohesive whole, whose purpose was to identify and shoot down threats faster than human beings could react on their own. The Aegis system first went to sea aboard the USS Norton Sound in 1973. Ironically, Norton Sound was originally built during World War II and definitely represents the bridging of the gap between the World Wars era and the modern computerized late Cold War. In the late 1970s, during the Jimmy Carter administration, a series of new cruisers was conceived to incorporate the Aegis system. This was the Ticonderoga class, named as was customary for the first ship in the group. Ticonderoga was launched shortly after Ronald Reagan became president. His wife Nancy christened her, and she went into service in late 1982. The second ship in this class, Yorktown, was launched in January 1983. Vincennes, designated CG-49, the third in the Ticonderoga class, was laid down in October 1982 and launched in April 1984. She didn't quite get the ostentatious send-off that her older sister did. Vincennes' patron was Marilyn Quayle, wife of Indiana Senator Dan Quayle, future vice president. The ship was named for the site of the Revolutionary War battle at Fort Vincennes in what's now Indiana in February 1779. George Rogers Clark, later of Corps of Discovery fame, was involved in this battle. Vincennes, as well as a lot of other U.S. Navy ships, was built at Ingalls Shipbuilding in Pascagoula, Mississippi, on the Gulf Coast, which has been in existence since 1938 and building military ships since the 1950s. This yard has built more Navy ships than you can shake a stick at, including over half of all the eventual Ticonderoga-class cruisers. In fact, in this photo of Ingalls Shipyard taken in 1985, you can see Vincennes together with 3 of her sister ships. This picture was taken in June 1985, a month before Vincennes' commissioning. Vincennes was 567 feet long, 55 feet wide, and had a top speed of about 30 knots. She cost about $1 billion to build. As part of the Aegis system, the ship had 4 different kinds of missiles, 3 kinds of surface guns, and torpedo tubes, all wired into the Aegis network. Notably, however, Vincennes did not have a vertical launching system, which is exactly what it sounds like, a weapon that launches surface-to-air missiles preloaded into canisters in vertical formation. Now remember that detail, it becomes important later. Upon commissioning, her first captain was George Gee. In fact, here he is on the day he took command of Vincennes in July 1985. The ship promptly went out to the Pacific. Her first big show was in the spring of 1986 at RIMPAC, which sounds kind of like a postmodern music festival, but it's actually a series of joint naval exercises in the Pacific held every 2 years with a number of participating nations. One thing I've learned from doing ship histories here on YouTube is that warships spend only a tiny fraction of their service lives actually doing the thing that they were designed to do, which is combat. The vast majority of their lives are spent on exercises or maneuvers, practicing doing the thing they were designed to do without actually doing it. This is in part political. Across many eras of military history and into the late Cold War, countries with big navies often staged large-scale exercises to let their potential adversaries know what they had and what they were capable of. This was perhaps especially true of the Reagan-era U.S. Navy just before the end of the Cold War. Now we get into the subject of how Vincennes got to the Persian Gulf in 1988 and what she was doing there. The context for this is incredibly extensive. In fact, I could fill a 6-hour video with context and probably still have material I'd have to leave out. So what you're going to get is as quick and dirty as I can make it. And it's mostly about the most destructive war of the 20th century, excluding the 2 world wars. The ghastly conflict between Iran and Iraq, which lasted from 1980 to 1988, at least officially. This story truly begins with the Iranian Revolution of February 1979, a touchstone event in world history. The US-backed Shah of Iran, who past presidents had armed to the teeth with lots of weapons, including F-14s, was deposed by Santa Claus from hell, the Ayatollah Khomeini, a brutal fundamentalist religious ruler who referred to the United States as the Great Satan. Khomeini did not instigate the hostage crisis where 52 Americans from the U.S. Embassy in Tehran were imprisoned in Iran for more than a year, but he certainly came to own it. However, Khomeini found, after only a few months on the job, that he had an even bigger problem than the Great Satan. In July 1979, the Iraqi government was taken over by Saddam Hussein, a dictator who had been rising for some time and who had finally consolidated his control over the country. Hussein's biggest problem was that he, a Sunni Muslim, was ruling over a country that was majority Shia Muslim. He feared, probably correctly, that the Shia Muslims in Iraq were more loyal to Khomeini, a spiritual leader of Shia Muslims, than they were to him. If Hussein's fledgling regime was to survive, he'd have to drive a wedge between the government of Iran and the Shia of Iraq. This is part of, not all, but part of, why Hussein declared war on Iran in September 1980. The perfect thing for them to be fighting over was this desolate little strip of land sticking out into the Persian Gulf, the Al-Faw Peninsula, which happened to be the only place that Iraq could get its vast supplies of petroleum to the world market. Not only are there tanker facilities in this area, but Iraq's major pipelines terminate here. After brutalizing each other for years in a war that neither Khomeini nor Hussein could win decisively, Hussein had the bright idea of taking some of his new weapons, such as French-built jets armed with Mirage anti-ship missiles, and blowing the crap out of Iranian oil facilities. Iran responded by taking over this desolate little strip of land, which meant that Iraq couldn't get its oil to market except with the help of another country, who happened to have a lot of oil tankers. Kuwait, which was, at least at this point in time, Hussein's ostensible ally. This made Santa Claus from hell spitting mad. Khomeini responded by attacking those Kuwaiti tankers transporting Iraqi oil, with missiles at first, but later with hit-and-run raids by speedboats armed with .50 caliber machine guns. The one thing Khomeini could not do was to close down the Persian Gulf entirely. That was what Hussein was trying to provoke him into, because that would bring the United States into the war on his, Saddam Hussein's, side. Kuwait was allied with the United States. It asked Reagan, who was then bogged down in the Iran-Contra affair, for help by sending the U.S. Navy to protect Kuwaiti tankers against those annoying speedboat and missile attacks. But under American law, the Navy couldn't do that unless the tankers were flying American flags, which they started doing. Okay, so you got that? Kuwaiti tankers transporting Iraqi oil flying American flags to qualify for protection by the American Navy against Iranian attacks. Ayatollah you, there was a lot of context. Okay, sorry about that. I really am getting back to the Vincennes, I swear. But before we get there, we have to talk about this. This ship belching smoke is not the Vincennes. It's the USS Stark, a Perry-class cruiser. On May 17, 1987, an Iraqi fighter plane, armed with one of Hussein's new toys, an Exocet missile, apparently mistook this ship for an Iranian oil tanker and pushed the button. The missile attack, there were 2 missiles fired, killed 37 sailors aboard Stark and wounded 21 more. The Stark never fired a weapon and ended up limping into port in Bahrain. The Stark's captain, Glenn Brindell, narrowly avoided a court-martial, but he was relieved of command. He wound up in the real estate business in Hampton Roads, Virginia. President Ronald Reagan, unwilling to trash Saddam Hussein publicly, blamed Khomeini and the Iranians for this incident, even though they had exactly zero to do with it. The Stark incident of 1987 and what happened to Captain Brindell is vitally important to the story of the Vincennes, because it partially explains why everyone was so keyed up on the morning of the Flight 655 incident. The Stark thing was not the last of the headaches in the Persian Gulf. Khomeini had laid mines all over the Gulf, and in April 1988, another U.S. warship, the Samuel B. Roberts, struck one of those mines and was badly damaged. 4 days later, American naval and air forces struck back. A small armada of ships and planes struck 2 Iranian oil platforms and sank an Iranian warship, the Sahand. This was, in fact, the only time since World War II that the United States sank a major enemy surface ship. With this ugly business done with, the Navy still had to get the damaged Samuel B. Roberts out of the Persian Gulf, through this treacherous narrow strait, the Strait of Hormuz. They decided she should have the escort of a vessel equipped with the Aegis system. Vincennes, then at San Diego, was hastily dispatched across the Pacific and Indian Oceans to the Persian Gulf. There were also other reasons for the deployment, such as to increase radar coverage of the area in the absence of plane-based reconnaissance. Also, the U.S. was now protecting all neutral vessels passing through the Gulf, not just Kuwait's. By this time, the ship was commanded by her second captain, Will Rogers. No, not that Will Rogers, the comedian. 0.1% of my audience will get that joke. But this one, William C. Rogers III, who took over for Captain Guy on April 11, 1987, about a year before the fateful deployment. The mission was, of course, not just to escort Samuel B. Roberts, but to take general part in the Kuwaiti tanker escort operation called Operation Earnest Will. You gotta wonder who in the military comes up with these Orwellian-sounding operation names. As soon as Vincennes got into the Gulf, they landed in a hot situation in more than one way. In addition to oil tankers with confusing flags and Iranian and Iraqi fighter jets swarming around like angry bees, there were those aforementioned speedboats, Iran's main weapon against the tankers, and harsh environmental conditions. Daytime temperatures could reach over 110 degrees, even on the water. Anyone who studies military history for even a short time will recognize that these kinds of conditions are extremely hazardous. The whole Persian Gulf was an active war zone. Let me also remind you that the Aegis system, Vincennes' primary weapon, was specifically designed to track and target potential threats faster than human beings could do it on their own. Even without knowing ahead of time where this story is going, you should understand the danger here. In researching this part of the Vincennes story, the shootdown of Iran Air Flight 655, I quickly realized this subject is like quicksand. It's very easy to get drawn in and pulled under, largely into arguments about responsibility, whose fault it really was, or perhaps more accurately, whose fault it wasn't. Rogers himself had a dog in this fight. In 1992, he wrote a book, Storm Center, defending his actions on that day. I read it, you shouldn't, it's not very well written, and every few years since 1988, another round of controversy has erupted over this incident, rehashing this endless battle about responsibility. So understand here that my primary objective in this video is to tell the story of the USS Vincennes. The debate over responsibility is part of that story, yes, but it's not the point. I particularly do not want the comments section of this video to become a platform for various viewpoints on responsibility for the shoot-down incident. That's not why I made this video, and I'm not sure that discussion would be very productive. With that said, let's try to get a handle on what actually happened on July 3rd, 1988. Early on the morning of July 3rd, 1988, the U.S. ships operating in the area, including Vincennes, received word that some of those annoying Iranian speedboats had attacked a Pakistani cargo vessel. The Vincennes sent one of its helicopters, it carried helicopters, did I forget to mention that? Anyway, sent one of its helicopters to scope out the situation. The helicopter came under fire from the Iranian speedboats. Vincennes changed course to chase them. In doing so, the cruiser violated Iranian territorial waters, a point that was later disputed. To hear Captain Rogers tell it, he was involved in an ongoing firefight with those speedboats, which, though annoying, did not pose a serious threat to a cruiser armed with guided missiles. Then something happened that changed the situation. Iran Air Flight 655 and Airbus 300A took off from Bandar Abbas Airport on the crook of the Strait of Hormuz on a regularly scheduled flight to Dubai on the other side of the Gulf. The flight was supposed to last 28 minutes. Although it was regularly scheduled, it was late in taking off. Flight 655 did not deviate from its usual air lane, as was later claimed. It was squarely in the zone it was supposed to have been, unlike planes in other shoot-down incidents, as I'll get to in a moment. We have to get a sense of what the combat officers aboard the Vincennes were actually seeing. They were cooped up in a darkened, windowless computer center, and everything they experienced of the outside world was told to them by the sophisticated Aegis system. It was a dizzying circus of radar blips, call signs, radio frequencies, and garbled transmissions in multiple languages. A lot of the controversy over Flight 655 involves transponder signals. A transponder is a beacon that a plane carries, basically to broadcast to the world who it is and where it is. Civilian aircraft broadcast in a different mode than military aircraft. Apparently, the Aegis system correctly tracked Flight 655 as a civilian airliner when it took off, but then lost contact with it. At almost the same moment, an Iranian military jet, an F-14, took off from a military base some distance away from Bandar Abbas. The Aegis system acquired that signal, which was broadcasting a military identification, and thought it was the same blip it had just been tracking, which in reality was Flight 655. The mistake cannot be blamed entirely on the machines. The The human beings who were parsing the data should have asked the right questions. There was evident confusion at the time as to the identity of the blip they saw on their screen. The captain of one of the other ships out there that day, the USS Sides, wrote an article in the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute in 1989, arguing that the atmosphere aboard Vincennes was tense and Captain Rogers unnecessarily aggressive. In any event, what we do know is that Flight 655's transponder was broadcasting its identity correctly, that it was in its designated air corridor, and at the time of the shootdown it was climbing, not descending, as the controllers looking at the Aegis thought. After numerous attempts to contact the flight failed, the captain gave the order to launch missiles. Flight 655 was destroyed immediately. There were no survivors. Years later, a U.S. government statement in response to a request by a BBC documentary suggested that what happened aboard Vincennes was something called scenario fulfillment. This is a psychological condition where your mind sees exactly what it expects to see, especially if it's been trained to handle that particular situation. What did Captain Rogers expect to see that day? Perhaps a repeat of the USS Stark incident, where his ship accidentally was attacked by a rogue fighter jet. Rogers and others in the command center realized almost immediately that there had been a tragic mistake. This incident was both like and unlike the shooting down of Korean Airlines Flight 007 over Russia by Soviet fighter jets in September 1983. That plane legitimately had been off course through a freak mistake that fooled its navigation system. Incidentally, that same thing had happened before in 1978. Korean Airlines Flight 902, but the plane in that incident was forced down, not shot down. But still, a superpower had shot down an unarmed airliner and caused a huge loss of innocent life. Something had clearly gone wrong somewhere. Even setting aside mistakes by computers and human beings who read their data, Vincennes was out there carrying out a muddled policy with an unclear objective involving confusingly flagged ships in the hottest war zone on planet Earth at that time. The whole situation was, in a word, a mess. There's another irony here too. Barely a month after the shootdown incident in August 1988, the Iran-Iraq War ended with an armistice, with both sides hollowly claiming victory. Perhaps to his relief, although the incident caused a furor in the world press and a huge political headache for both Ronald Reagan and George Bush I, who was running for president at that time, but perhaps to his relief, Captain Rogers did not end up selling real estate in Hampton Roads, Virginia. The Vincennes' 6-month mission, which began in April 1988, continued on schedule. On the way back from the Gulf, Vincennes assisted in the rescue of some lost Vietnamese boat people in Southeast Asian waters. The ship docked in its home port, San Diego, on October 25, 1988. The Flight 655 incident was to have far-reaching repercussions. Diplomatic and legal wrangling over the incident stretched on for 8 years. In 1996, the United States paid Iran $131 million in compensation for lives lost in the disaster. Sooner than that, in March 1989, only a few months after the tragedy, a van being driven by Captain Rogers' wife on the streets of San Diego was blown up with a pipe bomb. She was not badly hurt. Though presumed to be attempted retaliation for the Flight 655 shootdown, a years-long FBI investigation made little headway. The bombing remains unsolved to this day. Rogers himself was reassigned in May 1989. Vincennes was turned over to the command of Captain Robert B. Lynch, who was her captain until April 1991. Vincennes was only 3 years old at the time of the disaster, but she was already overshadowed by what had happened that day. One thing I've discovered in doing these ship videos is that the major part of understanding the story of a ship is appreciating the historical moment in which and for which it was built. Vincennes was part of a program that began in the 1970s, and at the time of her launch in the early 80s was custom-tooled to be part of Ronald Reagan's policy of holding off the Soviet Union by sharply increasing military spending and technology. The effectiveness of that policy in bringing an end to the Cold War can be and often is debated, but whether Vincennes was primarily conceived as a weapon, as a political maneuver, or as a vehicle for validating the resources sunk into the Aegis program, or all three, by the end of the Cold War in 1990, the importance of all three of these potential roles was changing. Vincennes seems to have been intended to spend most of her duty life in the Pacific, and it fulfilled that purpose very well. In 1990 and 91, she went on 2 extended 6-month missions around the Western Pacific, especially around Japan and the Philippines. I was surprised to learn that she was not involved in operations concerning the Persian Gulf War. Perhaps the powers that be in Washington decided it was better not to send her back to the area where she'd gotten into trouble before. Another Pacific voyage followed in 1994. Throughout this period, she had several captains, with Lynch being succeeded by Captain Thomas McGinley, then in 1993, Charles Burchell. Vincennes often took part in exercises or war games with ships from other nations, including South Korea, Singapore, and Japan. The ship spent a lot of time in and around Japan, and in fact, in 1997, her home port was changed from San Diego to Yokosuka, Japan. In the fall of 2001, after the September 11th attacks, Vincennes made a 3-month tour from Japan to the Indian Ocean to support U.S. military operations against Afghanistan. By December 2001, she was back in Japan. Her only significant mishap, excluding the Flight 655 incident, occurred in Japan toward the end of her service life. In October 2004, during a typhoon, Vincennes broke away from her dock and had a minor collision with the amphibious transport ship USS Coronado. There were no injuries. Time, though, was slowly gaining on Vincennes. Although her Aegis system, armament, and other features were updated over the years, the fact that she had been built without one specific feature proved to be her undoing. That was the vertical missile launching system. She wasn't alone in this. Several of the early cruisers intended to use the Aegis system lacked vertical launch tubes. What this meant in practice is that these ships would have to be retrofitted, and that was going to cost a lot of money. Regardless of her former glories, a warship's final battle is usually not with enemy forces, but with accountants and politicians. The money wasn't forthcoming from Congress to retrofit these cruisers. In late June 2005, only a very short time before the 20th anniversary of her commissioning, she was decommissioned in San Diego. Her final commanding officer was Commander Mark James Engelbert. After decommissioning, Vincennes went through the Panama Canal and sailed up the west coast to join the Ghost Fleet at Bremerton, Washington, awaiting her eventual fate. That fate caught up with her in 2010, when the decommissioned ship was sold to International Shipbreaking of Brownsville, Texas. So this was where her life ended, as many other ships' lives do, in a scrapyard. By late November 2011, very little was left of USS Vincennes, except for one noteworthy piece. Apparently, the United States government donated a section of Vincennes' forward missile launcher, used in the Flight 655 shootdown, to the government of Iran. Not its embassy, but its so-called interest section. The US broke formal diplomatic relations with Iran in 1979. I was unable to figure out exactly what happened to that piece of the ship, but its donation after the ship's dismantling just goes to demonstrate the degree to which the tragedy of July 3, 1988 truly overshadowed the entire history of this ship. Although they're probably ancient history to a lot of people, the events of July 3, 1988 definitely stand out in my memory, and it's hard to believe that it was more than 30 years ago. Vincennes herself has been gone for over a decade, yet the roots of the conflict between the United States and Iran, which was part of why she ended up in that situation on that Sunday morning, remain unresolved. Nevertheless, I think it's interesting to look at her history as a whole, rather than focusing just on the Iran Air Flight 655 incident. Thanks so much for watching. I have a number of other ship history and nautical-themed videos on this channel. You might want to check out both the Ship Histories and Nautical Mysteries and Disasters playlists for more. Also, check out the Long-Form Deep Dives playlist, where you'll find some of my more in-depth historical work, not necessarily on nautical themes. I've got some analysis on popular movies, and my project on the Amway Tools cult. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you'll look me up again for another bit of nautical history. Smooth sailing and safe travels.